Howdy, folks, and welcome to Moose Podcast 227. Months are flying by, days are quick, hours are getting longer of daylight, though, so it means somewhere around the corner is spring. Hard to believe these storms we've had the last few days, but it's coming. Good time to get out there and start planning your spring photography. I want to thank you folks for taking time to stop by and give us a listen. You're kind of quiet this past week. Only had a couple emails. Remember, you can send in emails with questions, ideas for the podcast. I'm here to help any way I can. But I do appreciate you stopping by, so thank you so much. Also want to thank my good friends at Bedford Camera, bedfords.com. If you didn't see the blog post, I'm going to be doing a online 90-minute chat with my dear friend Robin Layton, an amazing photographer. And we're going to talk about photography. We're going to talk about, what it takes to sit there and produce the image, create the business, have longevity in this industry. All courtesy of Bedford Camera and Nikon USA. So I hope you come on by next month, check it out. Just another example how Bedford's goes out of the way to help us photographers become better. So remember, head to bedfords.com. Use that special code MOOSE when you check out. Save yourself some real money. So thank you, Bedford's Camera, for sponsoring the podcast. Well, let's get right down to this week's topic. Minimum requirements. Now, some of you might be old enough to remember back in the day when we would go to buy software, we would go to an actual store, and there would be a box, big cardboard box, and that cardboard box would be heavy because it had this big instruction book and then a whole bunch of floppies. And then the box got a little bit lighter because the floppies went away to CDs. And then, as you know, now we just kind of download it all. But back in the day when you looked at that box, you would look at what the software was going to do for you, but then you'd look at minimum requirements. And it'd sit there and tell you what you needed in your computer to make the software really work, do its job, make your life simpler. Well, minimum requirements in this case means simply you had to have these minimums in your computer, RAM, storage space, things like that, so the software could run efficiently. Well, I've been thinking about minimum requirements when it comes to photography. So we kind of have sort of minimum requirements when we buy camera gear, but not so much, but we kind of do. But do we have minimum requirements when we push the shutter release on that camera gear? In other words, do you go out thinking, all right, I'm going to go photograph this today, and I have to have at least this, and this in my viewfinder before I even go click? Now, there's a lot that's going on in our minds when we're out there shooting. There's the fun, there's the excitement, there's the challenge, and there could be the trepidation, there could be the anxiety, there could be a lot of things. But are you thinking, or have you ever thought about the minimum requirements you have to have before you ever go click? With some good friends this past week shooting over in Skagit Valley, Washington, which was really just phenomenal. Great time with my good friends, some really great photography. Saw some really cool things, like bald eagles beating up on great blue herons, short-eared owls taking on bald eagles. I mean, it's just some really cool stuff. And we're sitting there talking during some of the lulls, and I asked them, what do they think of? What is in their mind before they even go out shooting that day? What do they have in their mind before they put their camera to their eye? Do they have minimum requirements? I don't know what makes these things pop into my head, let alone, explore them. But in this process, I went back to the day when I started out 40 years ago. What was my minimum requirements? Now, I remember, and of course, we're talking about film, that there's kind of the first thing I really wanted was the exposure. I really wanted to knock out the correct exposure. And you had to get in the camera. There was no Photoshop back then. And then, of course, there was sharpness. Things had to be sharp, in focus. And that, for a long time, seemed like it. That was my minimum requirements, to sit there and to, accept the photograph. But then I'm thinking, okay, that's my minimum requirements when I look at the picture after the fact. What are my minimum requirements before I even take the photograph? Because if I have a high enough standard there, it might make the post part of it, looking at the image after the fact, easier, faster, more rewarding. Sometimes I was thinking, back in the day, what were my minimum requirements when I put my camera to my eye to go click? I had to really think about it. Now, photographing critters, a lot of times, action was important. And then after action was the really super clean portrait. So I had to see those things in the viewfinder before I would go click. But did it stop there? Just those two criteria, action or really clean portrait. What about light? How did light play into my minimum requirements? How about what I want to tell as a visual storyteller? Did that come into my minimum requirements? So then I sit there and go, my memory's a little foggy, if not just gone for that period of time. So I had to look at some old images. Ooh, that was not a good idea to go back and look at some of those old images, because I kind of really sucked back then. I had moments, and there's some images that are my favorites, but when I put my camera to my eye back then, minimum requirements never seemed to have, appeared. Because in the beginning, the first year or two, I'm going to say results were kind of like all over the map. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about the time where you've put in a 36 exposure roll of film. So in other words, you shot 36 exposures and you're done till you put in the next roll. And you have this thing called a film advance lever on the top right of the camera that with your thumb, you had to sit there and forward it all the way and turn it to the front of the camera, then let it snap back. Then you push the button to take the picture. So besides having to manually focus, figure out your manual exposure, you had to manually advance the film and then fire the shutter. Now, I'm not trying to give myself an out, but that was for a guy who can't walk and chew gum, those 4 operations, that was really challenging. So then I'm looking through and I go, maybe I didn't have any minimum requirements. So then when in my photography did minimum requirements start to kick in? That was an intriguing question as well. Have you ever thought about that? Thought about your own evolution as a photographer and when your own standards or minimum requirements for what you're going to actually take a picture, when they kick in to make a difference? Now, I could sit there and use a lot of examples. I'm going to start with, let's say, an air show. What are your minimum requirements when you're photographing an air show? A lot of times the aircraft are what? They're flying when the light's not so hot. So then if a plane is flying that you've never seen before, don't have any pictures, your minimum requirements could be a lot less compared to a plane, an actual individual aircraft that you have seen and have photographed and perhaps had the opportunity to photograph that in much better light than you've seen right then. And so while one photograph, you're breaking the jinx, as we would call it, or you're, wanting to add it to the files, so your minimum requirements might be lower for that. On that other aircraft, which you have seen, your minimum requirements could be a whole lot higher. So that got me thinking, wow, okay, so then there's almost a double standard for minimum requirements, something you've never seen before versus something you photographed a lot. So then I thought about that some more. Okay, so if that's the case, then if I apply it to critters, how's that work? Because I have to tell you, I've had a boatload of people who say, yeah, I'm not going to photograph that. I've got it already. And that just drives me nuts. You mean you've got it already? As if when you took that picture, it was the best possible picture you could ever take in your life, so you can't improve it? Anyway, I'm not going to get down that rant. But I'm going to sit here and think about this for a second. Okay, I've already photographed that critter before, and now the opportunity is presenting itself again. So I guess my minimum requirements are kind of like those printed on that box of software back in the day. Since I already have a photograph in the file as a mental reference, I know how I can improve or what I should look for to improve. So then my minimum requirements are what? They're ones set by my own photography, my own standards, my own personal experiences. A lot of photographers look at Instagram, and there's some really great images on there. If you just watch HBO's Fake Famous, though, you realize that some of those photographs are highly cropped, highly photoshopped, highly computerized. And so what you're seeing there is not necessarily what you can go photograph by just going click without doing all those other things those other photographers did. And in that process, your minimum requirement, you could be setting a bar so high that it's not achievable because you're trying to emulate something that's not real. So then in those minimum requirements that we see, I'm going to highly suggest, and thinking about it, it's what I've done for myself, is my minimum requirements need to come from my own photography, own experiences, own camera gear, based on that moment presenting itself in the viewfinder. Now, yes, exposure. It's got to be there to tell a story. Sharpness, you've got to have, if it's a critter, the eye has to be sharp. The rest of it, that's up to your discretion. Photographing anything else, that sharpness is just telling the eye where to look. And depending on the subject, could be detail that helps the story. But once you get past that, how do you elevate your minimum requirements? It's got to come light. Light's got to be the biggie, okay? I mean, exposure is based on that light, so it can be sharpness to some extent. But the way you sit there and grab somebody's imagination, hook into their romance, grab those heartstrings, that's got to be light. But do our minimum requirements stop there? I don't think so. The beauty of it is I think that we will all have different minimum requirements. That's the cool part. Based on, in part, where we are in our photographic pursuits, based in part on the camera gear we have in our gear, based in part by the goals we have for our photography, and based by large part our own passions in which to move that ball forward and tell that story. So minimum requirements, if we were to cloud our mind with that when we go out shooting, at least speaking for myself, I don't know if I could take a photograph. That's the issue, right? Because, admit it, when things are moving fast, going through a checklist of all the things that have to be done between exposure and focus and everything else, and then adding to it minimum requirement checklist, by the time you go through a checklist, the subject probably is dead and buried. I mean, it could be a really lengthy thing. But if it was in our back of our mind subconsciously, can we work on that kind of plane with our minimum requirements? And if that's the case, how do they get set there? You know, it's a really good thing to do in the winter times to go back and look at your photographs, especially if you have a trip planned for this year that you did 2 years ago. Look at what you did. Look at the photographs subjectively, in which 2 years out, not hard to do. Think about what you accomplished. And then if you go there this time, what would you like to accomplish that you didn't last time? In that very simple act of looking at your own images, and strictly your own images, you're going to come up with your own minimum requirements. You're going to come up with ways in which you want to improve your own photography. And that's the beauty of it. Of just thinking the minimum requirements you need to go click. You'll save yourself time later. You'll have more fun when you're out shooting. And you'll grow as a photographer. So minimum requirements. They made software work pretty well on computers. I bet it'll make our own brains and heart work a little bit better with that thing called a camera. You folks take care. And remember to make every click your story.